All right, for composition of mathematics, here is the section 1.5 on algebraic expressions. And nothing's going to change how we read the composition of an expression. So when we see an algebraic expression that contains variables, we still read it the same way. We can look at this and notice there's three terms. So I got a 7x squared term, a negative x, and a positive 6. So we have variable terms, terms with variables in them, and then we have a constant term, and that's just a term that's a number. The coefficient of a term is the numeric factors of the term. So the coefficient, when I talk about that, we're talking about the numeric factors. So if you look at 7x squared, the factors are 7 and then x squared. So the numeric factor is 7, so that would be the coefficient. Now, one thing we need to see is for the opposite of x or negative x, that the negative sign is outside of x. So when I see that, I'm going to use a factor of -1, just like we did before, and then a factor of x. So just some terminology involved with algebraic expressions, and you notice the terminology is actually with respect to composition. We talk about the type of terms they are. We can see variable terms and constant terms. The coefficient is talking about the numeric factors of the term. And then, of course, the same thing with if I have a negative x, a negative on the outside, replaced with a factor of -1. So let's go through and do some evaluating with these expressions. So to evaluate an expression, we're just going to plug values in for the variables. We're going to replace the variables with certain values. But before I do that, I still want to read the composition. So I notice that this expression has three terms. So I'm just going to rewrite these terms a little more spaced out. So I got this -2x squared, and then the next term is a negative square root of z, and then I have another term, negative y. So what I did is I wrote the expression or the term separated a little bit so I can use the room to work with each expression. So I have three terms. The factors of these terms, so the factors of the first term are -2, and then I have this factor of x squared. So the factor of x that's squared, right, I'm going to look at as basically one factor that's squared. The middle term, again, I have an outside negative sign, so that's a factor of -1. And then I got this square root factor, so the square root of z is another factor. And then the last term, again, I see this negative on the outside of y, so that's a factor of -1. And then I have a factor of y. So now that I know the composition of this, I can plug in the values or replace the variable values with 3, y, and or 3, -5, and 25 for each one. So here's the values. I'm just going to substitute or replace the variables. So this first term would be -2 times, and then x in this case is 3. So I'm just going to replace that with a 3. The middle term, I have a -1 times the square root of z, and z was 25, so I'm just going to replace that with 25. And then I have -1 times y, where y is equal to -5, so I'm just going to replace that factor with -5. So one of the things we want to think about, the key to this, is that all variables represent factors. So every variable that we had actually represented a factor in that expression. So anyway, just think we'll keep track of that. But let's evaluate each of these terms. So now that I have the values in there, this would be -2 times 3 squared, which is 9. So the value of this first term was negative 18. The middle term, negative 1, and the value of the square root of 25 is 5, so this changes to 5. So the value of this middle term is negative 5. And then negative 1 times negative 5 is just positive 5, so the value of that last term is positive 5. So once I have all my term values, now I can just combine like terms, or combine the terms. So, well, negative 5 and positive 5 is 0. So this expression comes out to be negative 18. So if every variable in an expression represent factors, so then I'm going to replace every variable with a set of parentheses, open parentheses, because they represent factors. So that'll help this a little easier go through the composition of this next expression. So as I go through this, the first term, and again I'm just going to rewrite these a little bigger. So I got one term here and another term here. So I'm just going to rewrite this. I have a negative x squared term. And then I have a negative 5 absolute value of y term. And then I got a plus y square root of z term. So those are the terms. Now my factors, I'm just going to replace every variable with a set of parentheses or grouping symbols. So this first term, the factors are negative 1, and then x, I'm going to use a set of parentheses squared. So the next term has a factor of negative 5, and then the absolute value signs actually act as grouping symbols, so I'm just going to leave that open. And then I have a y, so plus y, so it's a factor of y, so I'm just going to leave that with open. And then the square root is also a grouping symbol of that factor. So the values, now I'm just going to replace with, well, x was 3, so I'm just going to replace the 3 here for x. Y was negative 5, so I'm going to replace inside the absolute value that negative 5. For the third term, we have a factor of y, so I'm just going to put a negative 5 in there, and then the square root of 25. So again, as I looked at the composition and realizing every variable is a factor, then we can kind of combine those steps. So let's evaluate each of these terms now. So here again, we have negative 1 times 9, which is a term value of negative 9. The middle term, I have to evaluate the absolute value of negative 5, and that's a factor of 5, and then multiply by negative 5. So this term value is negative 25. And the last term, the square root of 25, is a factor of 5, so I'm going to multiply that by negative 5. So this term value is also negative 25. So now I have all my term values. I can combine like terms. Negative 25 and negative 25 is negative 50, and negative 9 would be a total value of negative 59. So on page 34 of the textbook, you can try the problems under the You Try It. There's a video there too. But next we'll talk about combining like terms.